afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The next speaker glorifies in the Chinese name Mao Zedong, otherwise known as Stephen Mosher. Stephen is an author, speaker, and president of the US-based Population Research Institute, which we are very grateful to say is sponsoring this event today. God bless them. Back in the 1970s and 80s, we saw firsthand in China the horrors of the infamous one-child family policy of the Chinese government. Exposing what was going on in China cost him his position in Stanford University. He's a brave man. His presentation is entitled Climate Change, Overpopulation, and Other Urban Myths. Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy, for that kind introduction. I can see now why Joe told me once he mic'd me up not to say a word, because I'm everywhere. So I actually have a talk today, which is entitled a little bit different than what's in your program, and it'll require some explanation. It's called I'm a Global Warming Skeptic, So Arrest Me. What is that all about? Well, years ago, in an effort to stamp out mafia activities in the United States, the Congress of the United States passed, and the President signed into law, a bill called the Racketeering and Corrupt Practices Act, RICO for short, which was intended, of course, directed at the mafia. So naturally, as soon as the second most pro-abortion president in American history, Bill Clinton, got into office in the 90s, he charged pro-lifers with violating RICO. And Joe Scheidler, the great pro-lifer from Chicago, spent the next 10, 15 years of his life defending himself in U.S. federal court against the charges that he was engaged in racketeering and corrupt practices, which you think would be silly on the face of it and immediately thrown out of court. It wasn't. He won in federal court at the local level, then he lost at the appeals court, and he had to go to the Supreme Court before it finally ruled in his favor, and finally ruled that the plaintiff in the case, Planned Parenthood, had to pay his legal expenses. But it took him 15 years of his life. And those of you who've been involved in legal proceedings know that when you're facing an enemy like Planned Parenthood, or in my case, Stanford University, which has very deep pockets, they can litigate forever. The cost, whether it's in the tens or hundreds or even millions of dollars, is inconsequential to them. However, it's a little more consequential to us. Anyway, Joe fought the good fight and won. But we now have the most, not the second most, but the most pro-abortion president in American history in office, Barack Hussein Obama, who's been in office now for 7.5 years. Fortunately, he's term limited, so he will be leaving office next January, perhaps kicking and screaming, but leaving nonetheless. But he has decided, through his Attorney General, that people who question the myth of global warming are violating RICO. And the Attorney General of the United States is beginning to bring charges against individuals. So I'm glad this is being recorded, because I'm going to send her a personal copy when I return to the States, because I don't, I'm a global warming skeptic, so arrest me. Just to get a sense of the audience, how many of you here believe in climate change? Raise your hand. Okay. I actually believe in climate change too. I think the climate changes from day to day. I think it changes from week to week, from month to month, and from year to year. It also changes from century to century, millennium to millennium, and of course, every 10,000 years in the Pleistocene, we get an ice age. The last ice age only ended, 11,000 something years ago. And during that ice age, I don't know how much of the UK was covered with ice. I suspect Scotland was gone. But half of North America was covered by an ice shield. That's not something I would wish on anybody. So I followed the twists and turns of the climate change debate since I was a graduate student at Stanford University in the late 1970s. The academic rage in those days was not global warming, it was global winter, because there were academics, including the president of Stanford University, a fellow named Kennedy, who believed that the planet was going to cool because of human activity, that human beings were putting so much dust and dirt and particulate matter in the air that the Earth's average temperature would plummet, triggering a new ice age. He actually wrote a book about that, how things have changed. You know, now we're instructed by people that we're putting so much CO2 into the atmosphere that we have to worry about global warming, or whatever the climate alarmists are calling it these days. You know, I have to say that any movement that has to change its name every few years to reboot its credibility makes me suspicious, right? We've gone from global warming to climate change, and I don't know what's next, tornadoes or us or something. But I think they've gotten much more strident of late, and they've got the machinery of government now working in their favor. Recently, they've started labeling and stigmatizing those of us who disagree with them as climate deniers. No, you don't want to be a denier. And they're pressuring the federal government to arrest and prosecute those of us who question their science and their conclusions. As I mentioned, the President Obama's Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, has publicly confirmed that she has asked the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, to look into going after climate deniers under the Racketeering and Corrupt Practices Act. And charges have already been filed in several cases. You know, I don't want to get overly political here. We're in the midst of a very strange campaign season in the United States. But I can't figure out for the life of me how Hillary Clinton can be so confident that she will not be indicted for sending classified material out over her own personal email server, which is a clear violation of federal law. While climate deniers are supposed to be living in fear of prosecution because we demonstrate that the data from the real world does not support alarmist claims about global warming. And I don't know how other climate skeptics will react to being threatened for dissenting from the preferred climate orthodoxy of the Obama administration. But for me, it kind of made me mad. You know, this kind of heavy-handed effort to stifle free speech and scientific inquiry belongs in one-party dictatorships, not in the United States of America. I lived in a one-party dictatorship in the late 1970s. It is called the People's Republic of China. I was then at Stanford University finishing up a PhD, and I was teaching at the University of California at Berkeley. And I went to China with the idea, the mistaken idea as it turned out, that all was sweetness and light in the socialist paradise that Mao Zedong had created. And it took the villagers that I was living among for the next year about half that time, about 6 months, to convince me it wasn't so. How did they convince me? Well, one of them took me out to the common grave by a little hill outside the village, a couple of hundred yards outside the village, where 200 people lay buried. They were people who had died during the Great Famine in the early 1960s after Chairman Mao forced everyone into people's communes. 200 people died out of a village of a couple thousand, mostly the very young and the very old. Then another one took me out to Turtle Hill, which was a very short but bluff-like hill, a little further away from the village, far enough away so the gunshots couldn't be heard, where several dozen landlords and rich peasants, so-called, had been executed during the early 1950s by the Red Army because they possessed a little more land than average. And then others described to me how they were forced by the new big landlord to work in the fields from morning to night. And I said, who's the new big landlord? The landlords have been eliminated. And they whispered, the Chinese Communist Party. But what really convinced me of the tyranny of that one-party dictatorship was being in the operating room in the local medical clinic when women who were 6, 7, 8, and 9 months pregnant were being brought in They'd been arrested for a crime, and their crime, which they'd obviously committed, was being pregnant. As I say, they were in the late second, third trimester of pregnancy. They were arrested for the crime of being pregnant. I actually have copies of arrest warrants in Chinese, where in the little block where you write the crime for which the individual is being charged is written the word huaiyun, which means pregnant in Chinese. These women were arrested for the crime of being pregnant with a second child, a third child, and a fourth child in some cases. They were very surprised to be arrested for this crime because when they had conceived these second and third children, it had been legal to have a second and third child. And then all of a sudden, the one-party dictatorship they lived in changed the rules. The handful of old men at the time, Deng Xiaoping and others who ruled China, decided that one was the limit. And the women pregnant with 2 children were told they must have abortions. Many of them refused, but to no avail. They were arrested, they were held incommunicado. They were then taken one by one to the clinic where I was waiting. They brought in the local doctors. Some of them politely refused to perform abortions on women who were 8 and 9 months pregnant, women that in some cases they knew that were neighbors of theirs. And so the party brought in 2 army doctors to do the abortions. And because these women were so far along, they did these abortions by a new procedure, which they call in Chinese cesarean section abortion. They would do a cesarean section and then remove the baby, killing it in the process. Now, when I went to China, as I say, I was in the thrall of certain illusions about the People's Republic of China. Those had mostly left me by this time. But being present at the forced abortion of a woman who was 7, 8, 9 months pregnant, because I saw several of these procedures, did something else for me. It convinced me that there was evil in the world. Now, those of you who are Catholics, and I assume most of you are, will laugh at this point, because of course there's evil in the world, you say. That's what that's what happened to Adam and Eve. They brought evil into the world by the original sin. That's why Christ came into the world to save us from that sin. But I didn't believe any of that when I went to China. I was a committed secular humanist. I believed that everything was shades of gray. I believed that morals were relative and ethics were situational, and that at the end of the day, if you had a population problem, well, it's perfectly reasonable to thin the herd. Well, those theoretical views did not survive a close encounter with the harsh reality of what was actually happening in China. Because when you see an abortion up close and personal, abortion of a woman who's 8, 9 months pregnant, you realize that evil does exist. You realize what an abortion is. It's a killing of a tiny son of Adam or daughter of Eve who has done nothing to deserve the death sentence, capital punishment. And the grievous wounding of its mother, wounding not just in body. These women were wounded in body, and some of them because of the assembly line fashion in which these operations were being carried out by these army doctors who didn't bother to sterilize their surgical instruments between operations. Some of these women died as a result. But even those who recovered from the physical trauma of a forced abortion suffered emotional trauma. Emotional trauma so deep that China today has the highest suicide rate among women of any country in the world. Several hundred Chinese women commit suicide each day. Thousands, tens of thousands each year. They commit suicide because they're unable to come to terms to the death of their child, a child that in most cases in China was conceived in love and in an intact marriage, and was what the other side likes to call a wanted child. The end result is that some of these women prematurely end their lives. The other strange thing about the suicide rate in China is not merely that more women than men commit suicide, which is unusual in itself, but the women who are committing suicide are not terminally ill, they're not elderly, they're women in their 20s and 30s. And they're committing suicide because they've been forced to have abortions. And following the abortion, of course, that I witnessed, and following the abortions that occur in China today, the doctors do something else. They sterilize these women so that they can never go on to have other children, make up children, as it were, to make up for their loss. So, I came back to the United States and told my colleagues at Stanford University that we needed to speak out against the horrors of the one-child policy. We needed to expose this barbarity, this barbaric cesarean section abortion of women against their will during the third trimester pregnancy. And of course, what did they do? Did they all band together with me and loudly denounce what was happening in China? Quite the contrary. One of them said to me, "I'm personally opposed to forced abortion, but I want to go to China next year, and if I join you in criticizing the Chinese government, they won't let me in." Well, that was brave and courageous, wasn't it? Another one said to me, "Well, I don't like the forced abortion of women in the third trimester of pregnancy, but it's no worse than politicians in the United States who refuse to pay for abortions for poor women," thus equating the forced abortion of a woman at 9 months of pregnancy with the principled refusal of some presidents, Reagan and Bush among them, to pay for abortions using tax dollars from me and others who oppose abortion. And they all distanced themselves from me. In fact, they distanced themselves from me so far that I had to leave the university. I was in effect fired for being politically incorrect. So, just so you know, I'm inclined to be politically incorrect now and then. And that's why when we begin hearing about human-caused global warming and the need to reduce human activity by, in some cases, reducing the number of human beings, I basically said, you can count me out of that project because this is population control in another guise. Now, don't get me wrong. The planet goes through periodic warmings and coolings. We've already talked about that. We've seen it. We know from the geological record that the planet has been a lot warmer in past history than it is now, and it's been a lot cooler than it is now. We know from the geological record that in the Jurassic, and everyone's seen Jurassic Park and the big dinosaurs walking around, the climate was so warm and humid that there was no ice in the Arctic Ocean floating. There was no ice on Antarctica. Even the polar regions had a temperate climate. So think about that for a minute. And then more recently, the ice ages of the Pleistocene we've talked about. They ended 11,000 years ago, covered much of the northern hemisphere in ice. Temperatures were 5 to 10 degrees centigrade colder than they are today. Much more cooling than the projected warming. I went through a PhD program in biology a long time ago, and I think it's silly for anyone to refer to carbon dioxide as pollution. Now, there are obviously a lot of people who are being silly these days, including the American Environmental Protection Agency, which has just declared carbon dioxide to be pollution. So that as I sit here talking, I'm polluting by emitting carbon dioxide. As you sit there listening, of course you're breathing. I hope you all still are. You're polluting. And one of the least charming names I've ever heard for little babies is carbon emitters. But some on the radical environmentalist spectrum are calling babies carbon emitters. Naming is framing, of course, so they're being very clever in trying to dehumanize the least among us. Look, anyone who took biology in high school, what do you call it here? 10th grade, primary school. Anyone who took biology, secondary school, that's right. Anyone who took biology in secondary school knows quite well that carbon dioxide is a trace gas on which all life depends, okay? You get rid of carbon dioxide, we all die. It is colorless, odorless, and absolutely vital to the process of photosynthesis. And yet now, of course, it's being called a pollutant. Now, it is true that levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are rising. What this means is that plant growth will increase as well, because it's a plant nutrient. It means that food production on planet Earth will also increase. Now, a couple of years ago, my son, Luke Michael Guadalupe Mosher, why would anyone call his son Luke Michael Guadalupe Mosher? Well, he was born on December 12th, which will give you some cue. That's the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe. He actually used to be ashamed of his name, you know, Luke Michael Guadalupe Mosher, but now he's over 6 feet and about 240 pounds and plays football, and no one bothers him about it. So a couple years ago, he did a science project for the Arlington Diocese, Catholic Diocese of Arlington, and he actually won the Science Fair Award. Now, what was his science project? Well, he grew corn plants in different concentrations of carbon dioxide. He grew them in little greenhouses that he constructed in different concentrations of carbon dioxide. You can guess who suggested this project to him. As you might expect, the higher the level of carbon dioxide, the faster and more luxuriant the corn plants grew. And of course, he won first prize for this. As far as we know, no one has yet reported him to the Department of Justice, but who knows? So carbon dioxide is not a pollutant, and rising levels actually have their beneficial side. I question that, but I also question whether global warming is in fact occurring, because while carbon dioxide levels are increasing, the Earth for the last 19 years has shown a pause in rising temperatures. So we have increasing levels of CO2, but we have static temperatures for almost the last 2 decades. So a Canadian climate change researcher, one of the big names in the business, John Fife, recently said, there is a mismatch between what the climate models are producing and what observations are showing. We cannot ignore it. What the climate models are suggesting is rising temperatures like this. What is happening is more of a leveling off. What this means is the science is not settled. So if the planet is warming, and it may be over time, it may be cooling as well, we simply don't know, but because we don't have a long enough perspective. But if it is warming, I question whether or not it has anything to do with human activity. That's anthropogenic, right? For those of you who like Latin root words. Is human activity causing warming if warming is occurring? Well, think about the dramatic changes in temperature just 11,000 years ago, with temperatures 5 and 10 degrees colder than they are today. I'm pretty sure there were no human beings driving internal combustion engine powered vehicles in those days. I'm pretty sure that wasn't caused by human activity. And if you ask the scientists, they're not sure what causes these wild swings in temperature from age to age. You know, you hear explanations from changes in the Earth's orbit to variations in solar radiation. The sun is not a fixed source of radiation. The radiation levels vary a little bit over time. Changes in the Earth's atmosphere to shifting ocean currents. One thing is certain about these historical changes is they weren't caused by human activity. And finally, if the planet is indeed warming, I don't think there's really much we can do about it. Most of the proposals being bantered about involve reducing carbon dioxide emissions, that pollutant that we just talked about. But if we ban the combustion of fossil fuels, what do we replace them with? Now, you hear a lot of talk about renewables, wind, solar, geothermal, and biofuels. And if you think about it, you understand that such energy is hard to collect, it's more expensive, it's less portable, it's less reliable, it's less controllable, it's less scalable. That is, you can't produce large amounts of it by scaling up from the small plants. It's less versatile than fossil fuels. So if the United States government were to insist that all of us in the U.S. switch to renewables, we would have to restructure our entire economy. The rising cost of energy will necessarily drive out our remaining industries into foreign exile. China, which is opening a new coal-fired power plant every 2 weeks or so, will be happy to welcome our exiled industries. Just heard about the Navajo Nation in New Mexico. There you go. You see these shifting winds. I mean, we've never had winds like this before, right? It practically blew over the screen. Obviously, more evidence of climate change. So I couldn't have planned that any better. So I was talking about shifting jobs and industry overseas to countries which are less worried about burning fossil fuels. But I was about to say, my wife is mostly Navajo Indian. And the Navajo Nation is in New Mexico. And they depend for their energy and for their jobs on a big coal-fired plant about 50 miles from the Grand Canyon. And the Environmental Protection Agency has now said that they want to install, they are demanding about $1 billion worth of improvements to this coal-fired plant so that it will not produce any particulate matter, because once in a great while, visibility in the Grand Canyon is slightly obscured by haze. And so, since they can't afford to upgrade this coal-fired power plant, several hundred Navajos are going to lose their job, and the cost of their energy is going to double or triple. Now, that is a real-world example of what will happen if we switch right now away from fossil fuels. The end result of banning fossil fuels would be a sharp decline in our standard of living. Now, Great Britain would survive such a restructuring. America would survive such a restructuring, although we would no longer have the world's largest economy. But think about those who live in less developed countries. Think about the fact that if we do that, hundreds of millions of people will find they have virtually no access to energy. No access to energy. They'll have to turn off their lights, turn off their stoves, power down the pump that supplies their drinking water. Their tractors will sit idle in their sheds. Their motorcycles will lack the fuel they need to get their goods to market. For some subsistence farmers, I think the shift to renewables would literally mean a death sentence. They'd be unable to produce the food their family needed to survive. Pope Francis frequently reminds us of the preferential option for the poor. And I think as he becomes aware of this consequence, he would be horrified. And of course, right down the road from the declining standard of living that would be caused by a radical shift in energy sources is population control. Because the first result of the population controller, the first reaction of the population controllers would be to say, well, there's simply too many of us. Look, these people, can barely afford to live. They're starving. There must be too many of them. Or would they admit that they had brought on this crisis themselves by depriving the poor of their cheapest and most accessible energy source? Of course not. They would simply move on quickly to the question of population control. And they would say, well, we need to begin shipping even more containers full of drugs and devices to the third world to stop these people from having children because they're obviously having too many. Now, I really question whether some of the leading global warming activists are really as upset about the prospect of a degree or two of warming over the next century as they pretend to be. First of all, I'm always suspicious of politicians. I don't know if you share my view, but I mean, this is a wonderful, wonderful issue for politicians, right? Politicians ranging from UN bureaucrats to local state governors and even mayors, because it's an issue that they can hype in order to raise taxes and spend money and hire people and spend money coping with this crisis. It's a way of justifying their existence, of justifying increased tax rates, increased hiring by the government, and increased spending. It's just ready-made for them. It's also ready-made for the media, right, which loves a sensational story and has gone out of its way to sensationalize the story of global warming to sell newspapers, a dying industry if there ever was one. But so you have the politicians who've jumped on this bandwagon, you have the media who've jumped on this bandwagon. You know, if you think rationally about this issue, there are a lot of people who don't. There are a lot of people who tend to forget that we were created to be rational beings by a rational creator who put in place rational laws in the universe that rational creatures like us could come to understand and use to better our lives. If you think rationally about this issue, a warmer planet would actually be better for humanity. Vast tracts of land in Canada and Siberia could be brought under cultivation. Longer growing seasons would allow additional crops to be planted each year. You'd have 2 crops where 1 could be grown now. The specter of famine would be banished. Ice-free ports in the Arctic would shorten shipping lanes and reduce transportation costs. A lot of organizations in my country, the Sierra Club among them, have been stunningly successful in raising funds to combat global warming. The Obama administration has gotten on the bandwagon. They've just given $500 million without congressional approval to a United Nations Green Slush Fund. And of course, if the people who believed in global warming and who thought it was such a great threat to the future of humanity and the planet really believed what they were saying, I think they would be emigrating up north to Canada if they lived in North America. Instead, just like the rest of us, when they retire, they move south to Florida, to warmer climates. Go figure. So, you know, if you don't like the weather on planet Earth, just wait a century or 2, it will change, regardless of whether we do anything or not. I worry that the end result of the global warming scare will be an overreaction on the part of governments, and an overreaction that will keep billions of people mired in poverty around the world by depriving them of easy access to energy. And it's good to remember that some of the people on the other side, in the radical wing of the environmental movement, see mankind as a plague on the planet, and they're desperately seeking to reduce our numbers. I saw that in China, of course, years ago. And it's continuing in China. The planned birth policy is still very firmly in place in that country. You may have heard, I helped put together I'm helping behind the scenes put together a BBC documentary that will air in a couple of weeks about the move from a one-child policy to a two-child policy in China. And of course, the Chinese government has framed the issue as one of increasing reproductive freedom. Well, now people are going to be free to have 2 children. They're not going to be restricted to 1. What they gloss over is the most important fact about this policy. And the most important fact about the policy is that it's not really a 1-child or 2-child policy at all. It is a planned birth policy. That's what the Chinese phrase describing the policy means. 计划生育 means planned birth. And who does the planning? Do couples do the planning? Of course not. The state does the planning. That's why last October 29th of 2015, with the concluding day of the meeting of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, the 200 most powerful men and a few women in China met and approved the 13th 5-year plan. You all know that socialist countries have 5-year plans. This is the 13th plan that China has had since the revolution in 1949. And in the 13th plan, it says that the planned birth policy is being modified to allow 2 children. So this is the state declaring now that Chinese couples should have 2 children. So far, it's a voluntary program. If you still prefer to have 1 child, the state isn't going to intervene, but bear this in mind. Because of the 1-child policy, China has lost 400 million people out of its population. Its population is aging and dying more rapidly than any human population ever has. The labor force in China is shrinking. It has been shrinking for the last 2 years. Next year, China will lose 4 million people out of its labor force. So 2 generations into the 1-child policy, the leaders of China, Xi Jinping, who aspires to be another Chairman Mao, that's a topic for another day, has determined that China needs more workers. This change did not come about because members of the Central Committee were having nightmares about women being forced to have abortions at 9 months. I don't think they were. I don't think those things keep them up at night. The change didn't come about because Xi Jinping is a humanitarian and wants to come to respect human rights and reproductive rights. It came about because China now, 40 years into the 1-child policy, needs more workers. And what the Chinese Communist Party wants, the Chinese Communist Party generally gets. Now, I think that the reaction to the new 2-child limit is going to be underwhelming. I say that because a couple of years ago, Xi Jinping, in kind of a dress rehearsal for a move to a general 2-child policy, announced a partial 2-child policy. He said, any couple out there where the husband or the wife is an only child, you couples, you can have 2 children. Well, the party expected a baby boom. It expected 14 million more births the following year or 2. It got about 1.4 million. So about 10% of the couples who were eligible to have a second child actually said, okay, we're going to go ahead and conceive a second child. You see, the Chinese people have been subject to 2 generations, almost 4 decades of anti-child propaganda. They've been taught from kindergarten on that they should marry late, they should have few children, and they should only have quality children, which means that handicapped children are often killed at birth or later abandoned. And after almost 40 years of anti-child propaganda, many young people in China don't want to marry at all, or if they marry, they don't want to have any children, or if they will be willing to have children, they want to stop at 1. And so the 1-child policy has been successful, I think, at destroying what was once the most family-oriented culture in the world. That's now gone. And the effort now to turn back the clock and encourage higher birth rates, as long as it's voluntary, probably won't succeed. But who's to say it's going to remain voluntary? This is a government that will not hesitate. If it needs more workers, and if the Chinese people aren't producing babies in the quantity that the party wants, there's no reason why they wouldn't make childbearing mandatory. I mean, think of what they've done to young women now for the last 35 years. They've told young women that, first of all, before you get married, you cannot bear a child. That's still true in China today. Any young woman who gets pregnant before she's married must have an abortion. We have a project in China where we have safe houses where women can go to avoid forced abortion. And some of the women in the safe houses are young women in their late teens and early 20s who are pregnant. They're not of the legal age to get married, so even if they have a young man who wants to marry them, as many of them do, the state will not allow them to get married until they're in their mid-20s. So, forced abortion of unmarried women. In China today, there are still factories and villages where women have to go in every 3 months for pelvic examinations. Why? To determine whether or not they're pregnant illegally. If they're pregnant illegally, then they must get an abortion. A government that would do that would have no problem in doing its opposite, forcing women to get pregnant and then bringing them in every 3 months for pelvic examinations to make sure the pregnancy was proceeding. North Korea, which is an extreme example of a one-party dictatorship, the dictator of North Korea has just declared that everybody in North Korea must have the same haircut that he has. But he has also decreed that it is now illegal and punishable under the law for any doctor to insert an IUD or prescribe a contraceptive. Why? Because he believes the birth rate in North Korea is too low, and he wants to increase it. What North Korea is doing today, China could very well do tomorrow. Remember, because it is not a voluntary policy, it is a planned birth policy, and the Chinese Communist Party does the planning. So I think we have a little time left for questions, so why don't I end the talk here and see if I've convinced anyone. Have I convinced anyone that that global warming may not be quite as big a threat as we may be being told? Good. Are you allowed to ask a question?
Yes.
Okay.
As you say, the role of the family planning group, the Communist Party's planning group, has changed. I read an article in the newspaper saying that now they're going into families and reading to children and stuff. And,
yeah.
This to me seems really ludicrous. The article did go on to say that people were not that friendly towards them, throwing stones at them, and etc., etc. But they did say, actually, yes, this is because we've confiscated cows, cars, property, because people were illegally pregnant.
Yes, here is probably in a bizarre sort of way, and this is probably one of the funniest things I've heard out of China in a long time. But the story you're referring to, I think, comes from Lucy Ash at the BBC. Lucy spent a few weeks in China last month and was able to interview some couples out of the hearing of her minders. Now, you know how rare this is, right? Because generally when you go to China, as a journalist, you're always accompanied by someone from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who wants to make sure that the interviews you do not violate the laws such that they are of the People's Republic of China, and the people don't speak out of turn. But she managed to escape, the gatekeepers, and was able to talk to some couples about the tragedy that they had experienced under the one-child policy, the forced abortions, the forced sterilizations, the theft of livestock, the destruction of homes, and so forth. Wrote a pretty good piece in the BBC. But the latest gambit of the Chinese Communist Party is to redefine the population-controlled police as being child development experts. Okay? Think about that. So here you have the same people who, for the last 35 years, have been arresting women for the crime of being pregnant, have been incarcerating them, have been browbeating them, cajoling them, threatening them, have been taking them by force to abortion clinics, where in some cases they've been held down on operating tables and forcibly aborted, now saying, I'm a child development expert. I really want to tell you how to raise your children, right? You should start reading to them when they're 2, and you should change their diaper regularly, and you should watch out for various kinds of sicknesses and so forth. It's probably one of the most absurd things I've ever heard, that these thugs are about as welcome in the average Chinese household as a member of the secret police would be, right? Think about it. They're going to come in and read to little Aling when she's 2 years old, and her parents are going to allow this even though Aling's older sister was killed by this same individual a few years before when the mother was dragged off for a forced abortion. I think that's a hard transition to make myself. But you can see what the state is up to. The state is trying to remake the image of these people who've been committing horrible crimes over the last few decades. But instead of just dismantling the operation, which they have no intention of doing, they're just trying to, again, reframe it. In some cases, when twins are born to a woman who is only allowed one child, right? Either under the one-child policy or now, this would be a second child, but instead it's twins, so it's a second and third child. Local officials are under orders to meet their quotas of children. And if they exceed their quotas of children, they will be punished. They'll be criticized, they'll lose their bonuses, there'll be other consequences, they can be demoted. And so in some cases, when twins have come into the world, the parents are asked which one do they want to keep. And the other twin is killed.
All the governments in the world seem to have some sort of secret agreement and that they are all signed up to climate change. And it seems to be a self-perpetuating industry. And if I can give you a personal example, my son-in-law is a climate scientist, and he is a very strong atheist, and he's a computer modeler. He gets grants from, they apply, his firm is a private firm applying for grants from the British government for research into climate. Now, he has just secured £1 million grant from the British government. He is not going to go give any research back to the British government which says climate science is false. He would be out of a job if he did so. So it's a self-perpetuating industry. How do climate deniers get a foothold? Because they're always on the back foot. They're always chasing to catch up to what's actually going on.
Well, look, science has always progressed, not by consensus. Science has progressed by one lone, brilliant individual questioning the current orthodoxy, and questioning it so brilliantly and demonstrating it in many cases experimentally so clearly that other people follow. This is driven, a lot of the climate change science, of course, is driven by money. Because if you have two climate researchers, and one finds in his research that there are terrible dangers that are ensuing from human activity affecting the climate, His $1 million grant will be $10 million the next time it's renewed. The other researcher gets the same $1 million, but his research shows that the melting of the sea ice is not going to raise sea level by more than a few centimeters. His grant doesn't get renewed. And so the first enterprise grows and produces dozens of scientific papers, right? The other enterprise produces 1 or 2 scientific papers and then dies out. So if you look at the preponderance of the papers published in the climate journals, of course they find, damaging, deleterious consequences to climate change. In effect, they're paid to do so.
That's right, but how do they fight back? How do they redress the balance so that actual science, real science, is what is taken notice of by the government?
Well, I think again, and I think politicians have a vested interest in creating or sponsoring or encouraging crises, because that's how they justify their existence. They're going to save us all from some imagined calamity down the road. In a sense, I think this is a game of a waiting game. If we can simply delay the radical changes that some of the radicals on this issue propose for a few years or a few decades, it'll become clear. You get to a point where you can't, there's been a lot of number fudging in this business, right? All these adjustments made to the climate record to make things appear worse than they are. But as the evidence piles up, it becomes harder and harder to do that. So if we can simply delay the implementation of radical changes to the economy for a few years, a couple decades, until the evidence is in, I think the evidence will clearly show that this isn't as much of a problem as it is made out to be. There was somebody over here really patient. I think you were first, sir. Not behind you, and then you. Yeah.
I could guess that there are international issues in London as well. Just wondering what's your take on how much, if you like, UNFPA, ICTF, and Marie Stopes are actually pushing this and funding this. Obviously, the communist state is taking the lead, but how much are we, in the sense of our governments and our international organizations? Obviously, we are, because of how much in terms of funding or actual...
In China specifically. Well, when I first went to China in 1979, there were 2 organizations that were establishing headquarters in Beijing the same year that I was first there. They were the International Planned Parenthood Federation and the UN Population Fund. So they were in at the beginning. And the UN Population Fund did things like was giving $50 million to China in a 5-year period, and has continued to give that amount of money over the past 35 years. So, several $100 million have gone into China. But their assistance has been critical because, for example, they provided the computers to the State Family Planning Council that were used originally to set the quotas, the targets and quotas for number of births in China. So, think about the moral complicity there. They were the ones who helped to pay for the construction of IUD factories in China, where the IUDs are steel rings, which are made of steel so they can be detected by X-ray, which makes it easy to march women in front of an X-ray machine and make sure their IUDs are still in place. The other thing about their manufacturing is they have no tails on them, so they're harder to remove. International Planned Parenthood Federation's contribution has been smaller, of course, but these organizations have provided international cover to the planned birth policy from the beginning, because one of the standard reactions of the people, the vice premier in China in charge of planned births, to criticism is to say, well, look, we have these prestigious international organizations, the International Planned Parenthood Federation here, and we have the UN Population Fund here, so everybody in the world approves what we're doing. The other excuse, of course, they give is that the abuses that occur that I've talked about are abuses that are carried out by local level officials, and the central government is not to blame. Well, that's a standard line that's used with regard to all kinds of human rights abuses. Obviously, the Xi Jinping doesn't want to be personally blamed for these kinds of things. Neither does the Central Committee, neither does the party itself. So it blames local level officials who are out of control, which is not true. The local level officials are very much under the control of the central government and would be punished if they were doing things that violated state policy. They're never punished. They're carrying out state policy by arresting and forcibly aborting and sterilizing women. They always have been, and they will continue to be. There are still cases. One of the cases I found for the BBC was the question was, are these abuses still occurring after the implementation of the two-child policy? And yes, they still are.
Just one last question, please.
Yes, and I promise this gentleman here that sorry.
It was interesting that this gentleman, what you just spoke about the Chinese government, as one of the excuses, they say that, well, actually, the international and the Western powers already agree with us.
Right, that the world endorses what we're doing because, look, these international organizations have been here from the beginning.
So, in that vein, the difference between the West and China, from what I can see, is more like the different models of government. One uses power in one sense, and the other one may use cultural power, cultural instruments. What parallels do you see between the one or two child policy in China and the cultural zeitgeist, let's say, of child planning in this country? Because I suppose in music, in films, in literature, you'll have the kind of the things that are popularized would push you towards maybe planning children, abortions, and things like that. But they're not going to have like police turn up to your door like in China.
Right. Every yeah.
What's the parallels?
One of the ironies of China's planned birth policy is that it is in a sense trying to put the cart before the horse, because if China would simply have modernized, industrialized, and urbanized, that is, people moving to the cities, people getting factory jobs and not working in the fields, the birth rate would have come down naturally without coercion. But the party state wasn't willing to wait for those outcomes, even though that has been the outcome in every country that has industrialized, right? We have something called the demographic transition, where you see, with the advent of modern medicine, you see death rates falling, mortality rates going down, especially among infants and small children. And then a generation later, you see birth rates falling to low levels as well. So you go from high mortality, high fertility, down to low mortality, low fertility. And at the end of the day, you wind up, the people who used to tell us that the end result of this process would be zero population growth because every couple would naturally have two children, were wrong, because the birth rate has hit 2 children in all industrialized countries and continued falling. And we don't know where the floor is going to be, because apparently we still haven't hit that floor. So in a post-Christian, postmodern society, fertility levels are down closer to 1 child per couple than to 2, and still continue. In a sense, I think when you live in a society where the state has taken upon itself functions that historically were carried out by the family, the care of the elderly, for example. When you hollow out the family and you take away the functions of the family and replace it with state programs, right? Unemployed youth, we used to be supported by the family, now they're supported by the state, and they can live independently using that support from the state. At the end of the day, what you do is you drive down the birth rate. You take away from the family most of its utility, and you drive down the birth rate to well below replacement levels. So in a sense, modern cradle-to-grave socialism is a collective suicide pact. right? Because we all agree the government's going to take care of us, is going to perform all these functions for us. And so the family loses utility. People don't marry. They don't have children if they marry. But there's one thing the state can't do, at least with current technology. The state can't reproduce. And so if the state takes away from the family all of its functions and the family disappears, where are the children? Where's the next generation going to come from? Can't come from the state. And so I think that in our charity, in our care for our neighbor, in all of these things, we may have created a situation where we have, over the long term, we've doomed ourselves. And this isn't true of just post-Christian societies. I mean, in Japan, the birth rate now for 40 years has been, they've averaged about 1.3 children per family. And the Ministry of Health has done a projection saying by the year 3000, if the birth rates don't increase in Japan, there will be only 500 Japanese left. Now, I don't know how many people are going to be in Japan in the year 3000, neither does the Japanese Ministry of Health. But it is a statistical certainty that if every generation only has 1.3 children on average per couple, that their numbers are going to radically diminish over time. So, what our long-term prospects are, I don't know. But I think we've created a situation that we have to do something about. We have to strengthen the family. We have to reignite the desire among young people to marry and have children. Thank you.